Thank you so much. And thank you, Fernando, for inviting me back to Barcelona twice this year. I'm getting very attached to the place. It's lovely to speak to you about Frankenstein, and thanks for coming tonight. This is sounding much better. Is the sound okay on your side? Okay, good. So I think, especially after you've heard some lectures on Frankenstein this semester, there's a story that's kind of well known, and it begins with the story of the climate in which Mary Shelley began to write Frankenstein, which was part of my inspiration in developing this project. Sorry, I'm getting used to the sound. So today I'm going to talk about a project I've been working on for 3 years, and a book is finally almost out. It'll be out sometime this summer. It's called A Year Without a Winter, and kind of broadly speaking, I think of this as an exploration of the climates during which monsters are born. To start this project, I should say I was inspired or invited to begin thinking about this project when one of my colleagues at Arizona State University, David Gustin, asked me to do some thinking about the Frankenstein bicentennial. And I was doing some reading about how the Frankenstein narrative figures into the thinking about biotechnology in many emerging science and technology fields. And I came across an article about how biotechnology informs the way that we think about geoengineering. And having a kind of long-standing interest in climate and climate change and the aesthetics of environments, this article particularly captured my attention. And I've left this image up here, and I'm not going to say too much about it, but just to let it sit in your mind, by way of suggesting a constellation of images and themes that have come together and they're sort of strings that I've pulled on in the course of this project. They have to do with the way that we incorporate scientific knowledge into our aesthetic perception of environments, our ways of understanding history, our ways of thinking about the past and about predicting the future. So somewhere between the satellite and the barometer, between the sun and the moon, between a cloud that comes up out of the earth from a volcano and a cloud that comes down from the sky, I think we start to develop a kind of imaginative sense, an image, a constellation of images that form this climate for monsters. But more specifically, what came to my attention was the story of how Frankenstein was born amidst a particular historical climate crisis, which a group of authors said with the most delightful understatement, such climatic disruption inspired scientific as well as literary insight. And so here, again, this is an artistic image of an artist has simply taken a photograph of the sun in the Arctic and using digital photo manipulation techniques, blocked out the sun, and this is the title of the piece. But of course, this is precisely what happened as a consequence of the volcanic eruption that I'll have lots more to say about. But even before I knew about Tambora and the conditions of Frankenstein, I was quite fascinated and disturbed by the idea that today scientists are actively thinking about ways of blocking out the sun, using various types of chemicals sprayed up into the upper atmosphere in order to mitigate some of the worst and most irreversible effects of climate change. So if we look back to the conditions under which Frankenstein came to be, it's quite a charming little story. As Mary Shelley writes in the introduction to one of her quickly reproduced novels, that was republished in 1831, and someone asked her, how as a young woman of 18 did you come to write such a terrible, scary story? She sets the bar high for all of us. And she says, in the summer of 1816, we visited Switzerland and became the neighbors of Lord Byron. At first, we spent pleasant hours on the lake, but it proved a wet, ungenial summer, and incessant rain often confined us to the house for days. Some volumes of ghost stories, translated from the German, fell into our hands. We will each write a ghost story, said Lord Byron, and his proposition was acceded to. So this lovely competition, located at this house on Lake Geneva, in the summer of 1816 becomes the site of an episode that becomes to be remembered as the Dare. Dared who could write the best horror story and the best ghost story. And them being this group of travelers being quite talented. It included Mary Godwin, who would then go on to marry Percy Shelley, as you've probably heard, Lord Byron, Claire Clairmont, who was Mary's cousin and the lover of Byron, as well as Byron's doctor, John Polidori, who by all accounts lacked literary talent, but nonetheless had a kind of imaginative inspiration. So Mary, of course, wrote a first draft of the story of Frankenstein, and Polidori wrote a vampire story that would come to influence Bram Stoker's Dracula and is quite interesting in its own right. And these are, the vampire and Frankenstein's monster are sometimes construed as these kind of quintessential monsters of modernity. But for me, what's more interesting, or maybe not more interesting, but overlooked sometimes, is the climate in which one's imagination could be shattered, in which these kinds of nightmares might come to be. And of course, one can never attribute everything to any cause, especially what could be the cause of a great artwork. If only we knew, this would, make fill the museums. But nonetheless, it's quite interesting to focus in on one and sort of see how far you can go in telling a story in relationship to one of the sources of inspiration or one of the causes. And so looking back at Mary Shelley's story and some of the other literature that was produced in the period, which also, by the way, includes a poem by Byron called Darkness, which is also about the sun fading, dying, as some people thought that it was, because it was actually quite dark. It was visibly dark in Switzerland in 1816. And again, keeping in mind always that they had no idea what the cause was, and that this would be particularly fearsome, one might imagine. Imagine asking yourself, is this strange weather, or is it just bad luck, or does the sky look strange, or have you been drinking too much? Have you been not sleeping? Have you been kind of playing rough on your vacation? So it's interesting to look back at Shelley's text and look at the way that she writes about the environment and the way that her characters talk about the environment. And I know you've heard a lecture about polar exploration and probably thought a bit about the way that this novel starts, which many people jump right to the monster and kind of forget the environmental context, but as I'm sure you know, it's a story told aboard a ship that is traveling towards the North Pole, and it is at the behest of a certain Captain Roger Walton, who burns with the eager fervor of exploration to reach these polar regions. And the way that he describes his kind of subtle perception, and the way that the breeze, the smell, the cold kind of inspires him with imagination and desire is kind of everywhere in the text. For example, in one of the early letters, he writes of a breeze coming from the North Pole. He says, "This breeze which has traveled from regions towards which I am advancing gives me a foretaste of those icy climes. Inspired by this wind of promise, my daydreams become more fervent and vivid. I try in vain to be persuaded that the pole is a seat of frost and desolation, but it presents itself to my imagination as a region of beauty and delight." And this quote stayed with me in my reading throughout this project, because I think there are many regions of the world now, both near and far, that are perhaps ought to fill us with fear and being disturbed, but nonetheless, some people, in particular some artists, are drawn to these regions. And I think the question is why, and what might kind of open up in our way of thinking about our emerging environmental crises of the Anthropocene if we were to kind of open ourselves and embrace them, perhaps not with the desires for conquest and exploration that informed the characters of Shelley's era, but perhaps with a new kind of curiosity and openness. And the other place that I think are quite compelling to take note of the way that environmental narratives figure into the story of Frankenstein, not only the contextualization in terms of the narration aboard a ship, but of the story itself, is in this kind of reality trick that Victor Frankenstein himself uses in his conversation with Walton, but also implicitly with us, with the reader. In a way, it's a conversation between Frankenstein, Victor and Roger. It's between Victor and the reader, and it's between Mary Shelley and the reader. And he says at one point, "Prepare to hear of occurrences that are usually deemed marvelous. Were we among tamer scenes of nature, I might fear to encounter your unbelief, perhaps your ridicule. But many things will appear possible in these wild and mysterious regions which would provoke the laughter of those unacquainted with the ever-varied powers of nature." And of course, for historians of science, acquaintance with the ever-varied powers of nature and the way how different these have become known to us over the course of the history of science is particularly provocative. There's a great deal in the history of science that we might think to consign to the realm of literature today, but in other historical moments would be appreciated as clues to other orders of nature or other sorts of monsters or creatures that were long thought to inhabit kind of the world at its fringes. There be monsters at the edges of the earth. So in this case, Victor invokes this kind of acquaintance with the extremes, in this case of the North Pole or of the Arctic regions, in order to induce us to believe that he could have done what he claims to have done, namely brought a being to life after he had pieced it together and sewn it together from a charnel house. So again, it's a clue to how we might be inspired to think otherwise by our environments, and also a question. What if the environment kind of shatters our imagination and makes us open to imagining new things? What might they be? They might be new beings, they might be monsters, or who knows what else they might be. There's nothing, it's hard for me at least to come up with a causal story that would say there's a climate crisis, therefore we imagine a monster. It could have been anything else that Mary or these other authors had come up with. But of course, they couldn't possibly have known what was causing the climate crises that they encountered. They began their travels during the beginning of the summer of 1816. That summer would come to be known in its time as the year without a summer. But in fact, it was the climate crisis that would last 3 years. Until 1818, there was extremely abnormal weather. This was all in the context of a very cold period, sometimes called the Little Ice Age of the early 19th century. But this 3-year period was especially intense in the Northern Hemisphere, which is the source from which it is narrated in this project. There were, in this case, snow in summer in parts of North America. There was extreme rain and flooding and frost, massive crop failures, so food insecurity led to rioting, to political instability. There were health consequences, not only malnutrition and spread of disease, but also some historical reconstructions have said that this was instrumental in the spread of the cholera epidemic from the Indian subcontinent through Central Asia and into Europe. This is at least a very plausible argument. Of course, there were also political effects. There was the weakening of European colonial powers and new political configurations emerging within Europe. And Frankenstein is not the only significant, memorable artwork made during this period. There's also a profusion of Gothic poetry that refers to the weather and the climate within the European tradition. Gillian Darcy Wood has written an incredible book, Tambora, The Eruption That Changed the World, in which he tries to retrace and reconstruct the global historical events of this period so that we don't only have this very well articulated European tradition, but he also evinces poetry from China, from Southeast Asia, kind of different ways that this climate crisis was being registered. Only much, much later would we, not until 1991, in fact, according to the scientific literature, there were hypotheses advanced before then, was it kind of definitively asserted that this climate crisis was caused by the volcanic eruption of Mount Tambora on about April 10th or 12th, 1815. Was reported to have caused vast destruction locally, killing upwards of 100,000 people within the coming months by blanketing a whole region on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa and surrounding islands with a heavy coat of ash and toxic gases. But the global effects wouldn't be felt until the following year, and they're due to the fact that this eruption was the largest of the last 10,000 years, and it was strong enough to eject superheated gases and ash all the way up into the upper atmosphere, into the stratosphere, where they could be circulated around the globe, whereas normally they would precipitate out in the local region. And this, of course, is the source of inspiration for contemporary scientists and geoengineers who are now thinking about mimicking the effects of volcanic eruptions and injecting sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere in order precisely to once again block out the sun. And this is one of the paintings that sort of evokes this. There's a profusion of paintings that show a darkened atmosphere in the European landscape painting tradition. So Caspar David Friedrich, for example, paints the famous painting, The Wanderer Above the Sea of Ice, of a man, a sort of quite familiar, evocative image of a man standing on the top of a mountain, looking out over this kind of bright but also dim sky. And one imagines that this is English gentleman having gone on the Grand Tour and has climbed the Alps. But in fact, this is a painting painted in 1818, and he's actually looking also at a sea of ice and air saturated by Tambora's gases and sunlight blocked by Tambora's ash somewhere very high in the stratosphere. So there's a sense in which we have become familiar with some of the creative responses to this era and the way that they were subtly perceived long before we ever had a kind of grand narrative or a scientific interpretation of what caused these interconnected events. So it's a global picture that emerges much, much, much later, which is instructive, I think, for thinking about the conditions that we face today. So I was inspired by, first of all, the rhetorical appeal of this description of the year without a summer. And I began this project in collaboration with a futurist, a scholar named Cynthia Celine. And we started to think about the idea that, if a year without a summer brought us some of the most compelling literature and visual art of its period, what might happen during a year without a winter? And initially, the way that we construed this project was as a question about at some point in the future, there would be a year without a winter. So the first question was, well, when would that be? In fact, we collaborated with meteorologists and climatologists from the National Center for Atmospheric Research who took an interest in that question, first of all, in simply defining what a year without a winter would mean as something more than a rhetorical, a kind of compelling rhetorical phrase, but not at all specific meteorologically. So they took on this project of trying to think how they would specify that, and it would be a kind of change in average temperature such that this, I should say, is one of many possible interpretations that they offered, when the warmest winters of the past are now the ones that are the norm at a certain point in the future. So that this might happen around the mid-century, they estimated. So at first we envisioned a series of scenario exercises that would get people thinking, what would happen during a year without a winter? Would the tourism industry in my local economy collapse? Would I be missing particular foods? Get us thinking about how dependent we actually are on particular climatic circumstances. But what happened, in fact, was that as we started the project, 2015, 16, and I think now we're well into 17 and now 18, have become the hottest years on record. And it seemed that a year without a winter had arrived already, just in time for the book, which is always lovely rhetorically, although it bodes ill for the real facts of the planet. And we are now in a very different situation to the one that they faced in the midst of the Tambora crisis. Most especially because we have a profusion of scientific information about what's going on now and what's going on in the future. And we have a kind of communications infrastructure that allows us to know in real time what's going on in vastly geographically disparate parts of the world. So this, I think, issues in even these highly unusual situations where, for example, it was reported during the 2004 tsunami in the Indian Ocean, people received tsunami warnings in Sweden before the wave landed in Thailand or in India, even so much that they could call relatives and say, hey, did you hear this? Like, get away from the beach. So information travels so fast. It travels much faster than clouds do. So we're in a position to have a very different kind of immersion and awareness of the climate crisis unfolding around us. But some of the aspects of this climate crisis are very similar. It was cooling then, it's warming now, but likewise the weather is becoming more variable, extreme, unpredictable, where we also have to make decisions under conditions of uncertainty, even though we have more information in some ways, where we face just as much uncertainty because of the interconnectedness of our economies and ecologies. Likewise, the glaciers are melting in the polar regions, which strangely they also did during the Tambora crisis due to certain distortions of the wind currents and ocean currents, which I can't say too much about. But there are always features of a kind of global disturbance in the climate system that will be surprising. There will be cold and there will be warmth and wetness and dryness in places that it's unexpected. And this is certainly the case already, even though we face an average condition of warming. And likewise, there are health consequences, there are security consequences, and opportunities for social and economic changes, and also of really dangers. Climate always exerts a stress on whatever other conditions are affecting the conditions of people's lives. And it's also becoming immediately visible, and this image, I think, is just one of many that are starting to become rhetorically part of our visual rhetoric of rising sea levels. The high water mark in cities even like Miami or Venice is something that people contend with on a daily basis. They dress for high water, we drive through high water. So there's a sense in which we are already living in a condition that could have been described as a year without a winter. But there's one significant difference that we're in a position to recognize, which is that this project really addresses a climate crisis that is not definitive, it's not bounded historically. This is about trends rather than about a temporary aberration. A year without a winter is really about a year without a future without a winter, or a year without stable seasons, or a future without the kind of regularities that we have even called seasons in the past. So it's kind of fundamentally a challenge to what our sense of climate has been historically and what it might become in the future. And this is, of course, consistent with a new conception of the Earth as a space in which we intervene. I won't sort of get into the debates about the Anthropocene and whether this is a useful terminology or not. I tend to use it, although I think it's interestingly problematic. But I just wanted to highlight one comment that has come up in some of the scientific literature making an effort to define the Anthropocene. This was one of the efforts to decide when it began. And the authors say, we're a geological force of nature, but that power is unlike any other force of nature in that it is reflexive and can be used, withdrawn, or modified. And I think this is particularly important in the sense that self-reflexivity is not a topic that normally comes up for discussion in nature or among geologists. The idea that our self-consciousness and our way of intervening and representing the Earth, nature, whatever we are going to call our environments these days, is a sort of consequential to our exercise of force as a species or as certain members of that species, I think is an argument for moving past, these kind of traditional divisions between the arts and the sciences, and kind of integrating the roles, understanding that our philosophical and artistic ways of imagining the environment we live in is highly consequential for its physical conditions, and it's striking that this is not something that only comes from the humanities, but is also recognized in the pages of nature. So as I mentioned, I'm going to skip through this briefly, but these were some of the charts that were produced by our meteorological collaborators. And I think even in the past 2 years since we have done this, they have been struck. I think everyone has been surprised by the rate at which climate change is accelerated, such that this might not be the most plausible speculation anymore. But nonetheless, it was very interesting for us along the course of the project in posing the problem of what it would mean to define a year without a winter meteorologically. But this is all the more reason that it also is a question that needs to be answered in the space of the arts, of philosophy, of history. So one of the ways that we did that was, and I should say, the sort of first goal of this project was simply to reenact the dare. I thought, wouldn't it be amazing to kind of go back to Lake Geneva with a group of writers, maybe science fiction authors, and have them write stories again today. But from that point of departure, we started to think about, should we go to Lake Geneva? Is that the most relevant place to think about climate change today? Or perhaps it should be somewhere else in the world that is where climate change is being felt, where its consequences are more apparent. Although perhaps Lake Geneva is also an interesting spot. But for various reasons, some practical, some theoretical, it was decided that we would instead go out into the Arizona desert, accompanied by 4 science fiction writers, several scientists, my colleague, the scenario planner, and my colleagues at the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University. We decided to hold this retreat, a kind of historical reenactment of this summer holiday that Mary and company took at the Villa Diodati, this house on Lake Geneva. We decided to go to Arcosanti, which is an experimental town designed by the architect Paolo Soleri in the 1960s and 70s. And it has actually figured in science fiction and in science fiction literature and movies. It looks like the kind of place where you might imagine a monster even on a day when the weather is good. So we, of course, hope that it would be an inspiring and interesting place for conducting this kind of group thought experiment. We were joined there by Vandana Singh, Tobias Bakel, Nnedi Okorafor, and Nancy Kress, who are, as it turns out, a really wonderful collection of science fiction authors. And they joined us for 3 days, and in that time, we also heard lectures by scientists, geoengineers, some of whom were quite enthusiastic, others of whom were quite critical of the prospect of conducting some of these global experiments. One of whom, Hilary Hartnett, is an oceanographer who has had a very provocative paper recently published about a technology to refreeze the Arctic and make it increase its albedo, increase its ability to reflect light. So at a certain point, we felt a bit as though we were out there on the limb with the Frankenstein, or Victor Frankensteins of the day, the people who were conducting these kinds of experiments with the condition of the planet, which of course could save us all or could release monsters. And we were particularly happy that they were willing to have this conversation with their potential critics, as opposed to kind of continue their experiments behind the closed doors of the operating theater, was kind of the traditional image of the mad scientist. Some trips to the archive. I should say that these stories, they are collected in the book that's out later this summer, along with a series of essays about the history of Tambora, the history of Frankenstein, the architecture, the history of this architectural experiment as well, and some new writings from Dylan Darcy Wood about his climb to Tambora, and writings by myself and another curator about the kind of new and emerging artwork that is coming out in response to these encounters with extreme environments. But the stories are also published. They will also be published for free online over the course of this year, and this is the first one by Nnedi Okorafor, who also wrote for Black Panther, which is very exciting. And her story is an account of a future, a kind of fictive future and set in Nigeria in which, in order to combat the worst effects of climate change, most of the world is planted with a genetically modified crop, a certain kind of flower. And it sounds very charming and beautiful, and it's like really cute in the beginning of the story. And the problem is that her protagonist is allergic to the pollen from this plant. And luckily, she lives in a smart house, which eventually rebuilds itself over the course of her pregnancy in order to confine her and the baby to this house. And it's a really incredible story. I won't say too much more about what happens or, the success of this, but it's a real kind of constellation of monsters that come to be presented in the story. There's the monstrosity of the environment, the monstrosity of the response to its condition, the monstrosity of the cure, you could say, and then this house that kind of comes alive and this way of living within it. So it's suggestive, as are many of, are really all of the other stories, of the kind of expanded scope in which we have to think about monsters today. It's no longer enough to think about it as we see from the way that Frankenstein disseminates into popular culture. It's no longer adequate to think about a monster as like a funny-looking creature that hides off in the shadows somewhere. The idea of monstrosity that Mary Shelley gives to us is extremely useful also for thinking about environments, technologies, architectures. So this was an incredible kind of response to the Dare to reiterate it within the genre of science fiction. But it was also interesting to consider whether science fiction is really the right genre. If we think, okay, we're still reading this novel that was written in the 18th century, or in the 19th century, if we want to think in 200 years, will people still be looking at some sort of artwork or reading a piece of literature that was written today? Will it be a novel, or maybe would it be something else? Would it be another genre? Would it be a digital format? Would it be something else? So we wanted to open up that question as well as the geographical question of where the Dare should be staged. So in A Year Without a Winter, perhaps it's the desert rather than the mountains, and perhaps it's an outfit rather than a work of science fiction. This was just one of the many genres that we explored, speculative fashion design. We looked at the way that climatological awareness is being expressed from the runways to the art galleries in designs such as this, a dress that inflates when you go in the water, a very charming, bucolic kind of camping scene, but just in case it's also convenient. Or this artist, Anne Van Galen, who did a whole series of works like this, which were called, it was as outfits for dressing in a world of endless rainfall. So she imagined a future in which we'd no longer try to insulate ourselves from the rain, but rather to expose our bodies as much as possible and only give ourselves the kind of minimal protection, both in terms of social appropriateness and kind of physical protection from a fundamentally altered environment. And you could imagine this environment as the one that we would actually have here on this Earth, or of course there's lots of talk about living on other planets, which I think is a little problematic in other ways, but if we're going to dream of living in other worlds, I think we need to think very critically about some of the aspects of everyday life that would be changed, from our clothing to our diet. Even some of the more familiar activities that we have could be radically rethought. So another work, switching genres entirely, and kind of coming back to the scientific tradition, was a project by an artist named Carolina Sobecka, who imagined a highly Frankenstein-like experiment merging biotechnology and geoengineering. She proposes to modify the bacteria that inhabit clouds, modify the DNA of the bacteria that inhabit clouds, which could have an effect on the weather, but her interest rather is in using them as data storage devices. So we're quite used to the idea that we can just, save something to the cloud, or, save it into the email or into that endless draft, copies, and we have this kind of immense data storage that I think just thinking through this piece has gotten me very self-conscious about every time I refresh my email, for example, how data intense that process is. And it's also something that is actually data storage is a huge source of of carbon emissions. So she proposes a kind of passive data storage system that would allow data to be stored directly in clouds via the bacteria that cause ice nucleation. And she has been promoting this with a degree of seriousness and also a degree of playfulness, but really asking us to think about whether we could incorporate our digital age directly into the kind of environmental processes that it actually has a great effect on. But here at a festival that we held for the 200th anniversary of Frankenstein last year, also in Arizona, we have her performing, in a way, the role of Frankenstein. And the idea of this performance, she's here conducting the experiment, but it's also a way of staging a conversation about the regulation and governance of geoengineering technologies, of biotechnologies. And in some ways, these discussions are more familiar from biotechnologies, where monsters are more personified. They're Dolly the clone sheep, or strange-looking bunnies or frogs. Clouds, they're not so charismatic, and they're not so troubling. They all look rather similar, even the really genetically modified ones. So this project, as part of this project, she conducts a series of reconstructions of historical clouds. So the first one on the right in this series is the Tambora cloud. In fact, this is she uses dust and chemicals from that approximate what scientists think came out of the mountain 200 years ago to create a cloud. As you can see, it doesn't look so different from the others. The second is the first cloud developed to do rain seeding, so weather modification in the 1950s. And the third is a cloud that is part of a proposed geoengineering experiment, which hasn't yet happened, but is meant to happen in the Arizona desert next year, or perhaps sometime this year. And there's a lot of debate about the future of geoengineering, but I guess I've been attending conferences and kind of working actively with geoengineers over the last few years, just out of curiosity, and I'm more and more persuaded that it's a reality to be taken seriously in the same way that a lot of biotechnologies that were initially resisted, or actually, as Fernando has discussed, things like transplants of various bodily organs, they seem completely unthinkable, but they gradually, through experimentation and application, come to seem actually perfectly acceptable. And I think geoengineering is moving in that direction, for better or for worse. So it's something really to take seriously. And if an artwork is the space in which we can have public debate about what these experiments mean, then I think that's quite important and powerful, and an important legacy of Frankenstein as well. So this became another important thread of the project. And finally, I know that you mentioned the Antarctica trip, which I wasn't actually planning to talk too much about, but I'll just say briefly. In the course of this project, I had an opportunity to, in my mind, retrace Walton's footsteps. To go, rather than go to the North Pole, I went to Antarctica as part of a group of artists that went there to do some wild and fabulous installations, and I went there to review the show. And part of the question that I came away with was really what kinds of artistic or creative responses to an environment like this sort of legitimate our presence there. So we're familiar with a kind of scientific and economic imperative for visiting places that are highly sensitive to the impact of our presence there, like Antarctica. But this was one of the first, and not the only, organization to take artists to these environments in order to elicit their responses. Not to say that they should necessarily produce climate change propaganda. This is important, but I think that the mandate of the arts is much broader than that. And I think this Frankenstein story is testament to that, to say that what gets produced in response to a climate crisis and what is enduring in the space of art or literature might be something much stranger and more vague or more abstract than simply a picture of what's happening at a site. So after having this very powerful experience in Antarctica and these reflections on the specificity of the site, it suddenly dawned on me towards the end of the project, so about a year ago, as I thought I was ready to start sitting down and writing it up, that of course I needed to actually know more about this volcano. Tambora is a story that is well told. It's well known in the scientific literature, but the more I asked around, I realized no one I knew had ever been there or ever even thought about going or knew where Sumbawa was in Indonesia, for example. Jill and Darcy Wood's book was published in 2014, and this generated quite a lot of interest in the topic, so that we have over the last 2 years heard a lot about Tambora in the press and as a model for geoengineering, and we've heard about A Year Without a Summer. But I really got to wondering about what other stories this mountain had to tell, locally, regionally. In part, my ability to know those stories is limited by my own language facility, which doesn't include any of the local languages spoken in Indonesia. But nonetheless, I thought this is an important question to ask, is what does an actual encounter with this historical narrative and this geographical site afford? So last August, I was accompanied, in fact, by one of the artists that I met in Antarctica to Tambora. I left this picture up for a little while because I think this is a much more familiar way of looking at the volcano than any of the pictures that I came home with. As a satellite photo, you can see the crater is very big. Wow, it's hard to say how big is a crater. It's 6.5 kilometers across. It's not the widest or the deepest, but the explosion was the biggest. So it's one of the contenders for the biggest eruption in history. But nonetheless, it's huge and it's daunting. And when you fly over it, it seems as though it kind of takes forever. But in case you wonder, oh, how could we possibly not know this volcano well? Well, if you've traveled in Indonesia, you realize that the whole landscape is dotted with volcanoes. But nonetheless, I was excited to visit the volcanic monitoring station that monitored the biggest volcanic eruption in the last 10,000 years. This was it. It's a simple operation. There's a seismograph that lives in a suitcase, and it looks like it's been there for 60 years, 70 years, I'm not sure quite how long. The computers are, of course, a bit younger, but it's quite a simple operation, and they collect data on the rumblings of the mountain, and they transmit it to Indonesia's extremely busy Center for Geological Hazard Mitigation, which is not very impressed by Tambora, as it turns out. For most of the time, although in 2011 and 12 it did rumble and spew gas and ash for long enough that the local population was evacuated. There was some worry that it might erupt again. But nonetheless, this was not our primary. I think when we were on the way to the trip, this kind of anticipatory logic of visiting a huge, a volcano that's had this enormous eruptive potential, would this be a danger? This was present in our mind. Arriving there, it didn't seem like a concern. And this kind of, there were many things about this experience that kind of challenged my sense of what it means to be aware of a local and a kind of global ecological condition at once. So what does it mean to immerse ourselves in a world that we know is changing with respect to climate? And what does it mean to visit a site that has a particular relationship to a historical narrative or to our contemporary narrative? So it was a long process of climbing the mountain, and it mostly looked like this. We climbed for hours and hours in a fog. Fernando has seen even more pictures of the fog than I'll show today, but there was a very long period of immersion and, as it turned out, very inspiring reflection afforded by not being able to see even the ground beneath our feet. It was so thick that actually the 2 meters, or give or take, that it takes to look down at your own feet would show you a ground obscured by fog. grown over by some small plants. We wondered whether the entire mountain had been, it was actually cleared by the volcano, was everything, all of the surface was covered with molten rock and dust and burned away. But it's also been cleared since by a Swedish coffee plantation, by more recently for the purposes of planting other crops. So it's a very intensively harvested and farmed landscape. So in the course of this trip, we were quite curious how much we would be able to recognize Tambora's eruption as something that had happened in the landscape, or whether this would be sort of buried under the many other things that had happened. As it turns out, it's many ways it's hard to tell, but there are rocks, huge rocks that litter the landscape from, near and far, and they look as though they fell burning from the sky yesterday, which is incredible to see. But climbing endlessly through this fog, we had the sense that we didn't know whether we would actually, what would happen when we reached the top. We thought we might actually just fall right in to the crater, and in fact we almost did, because it all of a sudden appeared like this, and we realized that what had happened was that the heat from the crater sweeps up into this wall of clouds that accumulates on the side of the mountain and creates just a wall of fog. And suddenly, when we saw this, a name that we had read about in our inquiries into Tambora and its local language and its local lore came into play. We had read that Tambora can be translated from the local language spoken in the town of Bima as an invitation to disappear. And it's kind of an evocative phrase, and as for walking in the clouds for hours and hours and sort of playing and hiding and seeing how far our voices could carry, suddenly this seemed like a very suggestive name of what the mountain could have meant to the local people. So it suggested, in fact, that it was an insult, like, get out of here, get lost, but it was also maybe a way of describing the way that the mountain first would hide behind these clouds and then appear again. It used to have an enormous peak, which then, of course, disappeared. And one could imagine looking down into this crater just how much dirt and rock and stone and rubble it would take blasted up into the atmosphere to block out the sun and shroud the whole world in darkness for 3 years. So it became, of course, in many ways, a generative meditation on rethinking that historical narrative and the way that we have the stories that we have to encounter this historical site. It was surprising to hear the story of Mary Shelley in The Year Without a Summer all over from the few tour guides that we met. Visiting the mountain, it seemed that this story had been retold in the Indonesian press. I mean, as far as we could understand from the Google translating a lot of articles, interest in Tambora had been revived intensively in the region by the Frankenstein bicentennial, which I think is an incredible case of the way that global culture comes to confer very new meanings on local narratives of a place. But there were also other narratives competing, and one of them was this kind of contemplation of whether Tambora was a site, whether it disappeared as a consequence of a local rivalry or a war between local groups that had lived there, and whether this was preserved in the language. So in trying to think about how these interconnected stories tied together then with A Year Without a Summer as a kind of proxy for the entire global Tambora crisis, and A Year Without a Winter as a proxy for our global environmental crisis today, we realized as we moved away from Tambora that we needed to not only think about the volcano and not think abstractly about climate change, but think more specifically about some of the concrete and local manifestations of our engagements with climate today. So this is what we saw a great deal of as we departed from the volcano and made our way through Indonesia and Malaysia. These are bunches of palm oil fruit and vast swaths of the landscape that look like this. At first, it looks like a kind of maybe a kind of idyllic tropical landscape, but the regular placement of the trees and their kind of even height and not too much underbrush at all beneath is suggestive, of course, of what these are. These are oil palm plantations. And they blanket vast areas of Southeast Asia. As you've probably heard about, the burning of the peatlands and jungle is a huge problem in this part of the world. They're burned en masse in order to clear the old forests and make way for palm oil plantations. This results, of course, in enormous biodiversity loss, compromising habitats for indigenous communities and communities that are not living directly in the forest, but have been dependent on the kinds of produce and modes of life related to peripheral jungles for a very long time. So this is kind of uniformly recognized as a huge environmental tragedy, not only locally, but also because in 2015, for example, it blanketed huge areas of Malaysia, Singapore, Australia. Huge parts of this whole region were blanketed in a thick, choking, toxic smoke. And Indonesia went into high gear, saying, okay, we have to limit the burning of the peatlands and the jungles, but nonetheless, the demand for palm oil continues, and it continues to make this the fastest growing crop available today. And where does it end up? It ends up in our little snacks. I'm sure we have all eaten palm oil today, and we all have it on our skin, in our hair, it's in our toothpaste. It's actually everywhere. And in case you wonder why Nutella, for example, tastes so good and has that nice creamy, smooth feeling, it melts at every temperature. Kinder Bueno is a very popular kind of health snack in Germany. I could go on and on and on. Look at your shampoo bottle. Anything that says vegetable fat, usually palm oil, as it's a highly saturated fat. It's offered as a healthier fat. It's a vegetable fat rather than a dairy or an animal fat. So it's proffered even as a source of biodiesel. It's proffered as a source of sustainable energy. And it's in something like 50% of processed or packaged foods worldwide. It's also very popular as a cooking oil, as something to, fry foods in many areas in Asia and Africa. And it's increasingly popular in Europe and North America as well. And so there's something really kind of dark and haunting about this, in the sense that I think the environmental impacts of palm oil are fairly well known. I don't know, did you hear about have you heard about palm oil and the burnings in Southeast Asia? I would say it's one of the, it's not so difficult to give publicity to a strip landscape like this. And yet, we kind of continue on munching our snacks. And you could say, where is the party? The party, it's a children's birthday party on the grave of nature, in a sense. We're just kind of we're indulging ourselves in the most banal ways. We know that airplanes and car engines and fossil fuel extraction is a huge driver of climate change. But this is a place where we engage in these high impact behaviors, and in a way that's filled with banal joy, or if we even notice it at all. So this became, in this whole experience really, but became an inspiration for a new piece by the artist who accompanied me to Tambora, Julian Charrière. And I'm so thrilled about this book, as I'm going to launch it on Saturday. This became a book and an exhibition called An Invitation to Disappear. And An Invitation to Disappear kind of takes up this question that arises with Tambora, but then arises in very different ways in our interconnected climate crisis today, which is how to think about our kind of absent presence in these global landscapes. So in the same way that during the Tambora crisis, people were subject to this kind of global interconnected phenomena. They were breathing Tambora air, they were riding under Tambora skies, they were drinking kind of Tambora contaminated water, but no one had any idea. Today, we are kind of present in these landscapes, but without any kind of robust sense of what that would look like. We see an empty forest, we see a candy bar, but to locate ourselves in that space, for example, how do I locate myself in that palm oil plantation from here? So I should say that I feel so lucky to be that this anniversary moment brought us into contact, and we recounted this encounter and our trip to Tambora and a series of postcards that led to this project. Julian decided to join me on this climb because he was commissioned to do an installation at the Mauvoisin Dam, which is in the town of Bagné in Switzerland, which experienced a terrible flood in 1818 as a consequence of, there's a glacier high up on the mountain above the town, and every year a lake forms behind the glacier. And normally in summer the glacier melts and the lake runs out, and it provides water to a huge region of southern Switzerland. But by 1818, everyone realized that the glacier had gotten too big and the water had not poured out from behind it. And they were well aware that there could be a very dangerous flood, and it could affect a huge area, a huge number of the population of the region. And they actually undertook an incredible feat of Swiss engineering and had people drill into the mountain in an effort to release the water. And they did actually drain some of the dam. Many people killed in the process of trying to do this. But nonetheless, the lake did eventually overflow, and this was remembered as the debacle of Mauvoisin. So in commemorating this local event and inviting Julian to contribute to the exhibition, we had this incredible moment of realizing that this very Swiss local tragedy was connected to a global, interconnected climate process that was, it was of course caused by the whole Tambora crisis. So Julian and I went to Tambora, and of course we told the story, and we ended up kind of starting to think through this paradox of what it is that we're doing there. What are we doing actually literally here? And this is a site that we didn't go to. This is a site that we saw from the side of the road, from out the top of the plain, while we were hurrying to get to the site of greater interest. And this is always the problem with disasters, is that you go for the spectacular one. Of course, we go for the volcano. Even the 200-year-old volcano is more excited than vast swath of palm oil plantations. But it was when we were leaving that we realized this is actually the landscape that we visited. So what this project is, it centers around a film, and this is the visual imagery, looks very much like this. And one is drawn in very much like we were on the mountain through this mist, this fog, towards something, a kind of object of desire. And as the camera it moves, and this is a 75-minute film, as the camera moves towards this kind of point of colorful and light fluctuation, a sound starts to rise, and it's music, and you start to realize that it's like a techno beat, and it sounds like there's a party, maybe a jungle party, if you've ever taken a tropical holiday, full moon party. Something seems to be going on somewhere in the distance. From the look of it, it's hard to say what it is. It could be a fire on the mountain, it could be a volcanic eruption. In fact, what it is a party, but for no one. And an invitation to disappear is a kind of meditation on the way that we're, in effect, this is actually what we're doing. We're partying in the jungle. The party is there. We might as well be there drinking and staying up all night and dancing on the floor of the forest. But no one's there. And it's a kind of invitation to consider our presence within these landscapes. Back at the gallery, it's a much more ghastly kind of situation, filled with the fruit of this harvest, these huge blocks of the fat that are extracted from this landscape. And what they do in this part of the installation is that they power a motor, which is the most loud and horrific sounding thing you could ever hope to not spend too much time in this gallery. And it runs on palm oil. And here I think it has a kind of, evokes some of the visual rhetoric of Frankenstein, which was very much the artist's intention. It looks sort of like a blood transfusion into this machine. And all it does is it powers a smoke machine. And white smoke fills the gallery, and black smoke goes out the back of the gallery into the parking lot. And I think this is also actually a very, very dark meditation on our relationship to these landscapes of extraction. So it's my hope that I'm very much in the space of this artwork in the moment, because I just finished a long text about it. But I think all of the pieces that have come out of this project have been very compelling for me, and I hope that they will be conducive to thinking our way into a global and a very local problem at once. So I forgot to set the timer. I think probably I've spoken long enough, but suffice to say, I'm very much looking forward to this book being out in August or thereabouts, and you can pre-order it on Amazon. Thank you.
To what extent do you think that all the artistic approach to the climate change problem can really be an effective way to establish a dialogue between experts, politicians, and let's say the global debates on climate change? You know, for example, could you imagine these sort of exhibitions, for example, in a sort of a UN summit, having a real impact in the global discussion about how to deal with global change, which is a terrible, difficult, and puzzling problem we have nowadays. What do you feel about that in that sense? And my second point is, to what extent history is just a sort of inspiration or a real way, even methodologically, to try to establish strong comparison between what happened in the Frankenstein story in that summer. To what extent do you think that there is real comparative work, or is just a sort of inspiration for you?
So I would say I would be content as a curator. I would be content with it as a source of inspiration. But what I have started to I have persuaded myself in the course of the project that historical moment has more to offer than inspiration, that it's actually. So I would say that addressing the first question, you know, how important or how useful is art or literature in this context, I think it remains to be seen whether art or any other thing is going to sort of push us over the edge. I think it's important, certainly, not so much that one image is going to flip the switch, but that our way of narrating a situation is kind of underlies the political landscape. And it was my hope that this project would have political efficacy, not from I thought in the beginning about taking it directly to a kind of political organization, and decided not to do that immediately, because I wanted to give it sort of the creative space to turn into whatever it would turn into, instead of constraining the message. But towards the end of this project, it has been taken up. So I have been running some workshops with the Red Cross, Red Crescent, and we did a workshop at the COP23 last fall. And they have started taking it up a great deal in their, it's the climate center of that organization. They've been using it quite a bit. We held a workshop at the European Commission Joint Research Center, and they were quite interested in the way that narratives kind of underlie the political landscape. So legislation, perception of risk, perception of what sort of social and economic conditions are tolerable there is always a way that these things get decided in terms of an image, a norm, a standard of how things should be. I've started to think that climate change is not going to be a problem until the concept of climate actually changes. So climate is usually something that's in the background, And until it starts to be in the foreground, we know that climate change exacerbates income inequality, it exacerbates environmental racism, it exacerbates health consequences, it's a security risk. Everyone knows that it's a condition of everyday life, and it's a condition of trouble. It's a condition of most of the problems that any one of us care about in an active political way. But on a daily basis, if you ask me, are you more worried about climate change, or are you more worried about a group of people that are losing their jobs, losing their public safety, have food insecurity? Well, it's easy to say, address a more immediate problem and not think about the underlying problem. And climate change is definitely not the only underlying problem causing all of these other historical problems we've had for a long time. But I think climate itself, as a background condition, it's starting to change. It's starting to be a primary factor rather than just what makes possible everything else. And that's where I think the arts, the humanities, history, having a different understanding of what climate is, might allow us to think very differently in a practical way about what to do about it. Because if it's a thing that you can't count on, if nature is not a cyclical, patterned, eternal return of the same, that's a big problem. And I think it's kind of embedded within our kind of idea of climate itself, that there's part of the inaction. I also think, well, I have other thoughts about causes of inaction, but maybe I'll save that for time for questions. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. Do you think that the type of cause of the climate crisis have an effect to the difference on the monster of the type of monsters from Mary Shelley or the artwork nowadays in this world?
I would tend to say no, because I think Mary Shelley she's responding very particularly to the historical conditions of her day. So the science of her day, the kind of social norms of the day. I think this concern about the source of life and of making a being was very particular. But if you look, if you look more broadly at lots of different kinds of arts and literature, you could come to see a pattern. But to say that, that I don't think we could predict what would happen in response to climate, but that it's more the other historical circumstances that would appear differently in light of a climatic disturbance. And one of the big things that I think that I hope will come to appearance in our present day that was not a concern for her is that whether things are warming or cooling, we have these forms of global infrastructure that are sensitive to climate today that were not in place in her day. And we're also comfortable with some of the kinds of science that freaked them out and fascinated them, that they wanted to play around with. So, I don't know, it's an interesting question actually, because I think we wouldn't know unless we had other cases for comparison. But it's entirely possible. I would love to answer yes, but I feel like I have to be more conservative. What do you think?
I suppose that the artists now had the awareness that the climate crisis now is provoked by humans, and then borrow as natural product or catastrophe. And I thought that there will be an influence in artists for producing their monsters, but I don't know.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, I think in a way we find ourselves a little bit more similar to Victor these days, maybe.
You used several times the adjective global, but you never used the word globalization. And you also did not really say very much about the Anthropocene. It came up, of course, but and I bring it up because okay, so in 1816, Tambora, huge eruption. It affected weather worldwide and so on. But there was not a global process. Globalization is a human thing. It's not the act of nature. I mean, the fact that the entire Earth undergoes an ice age, let's put it that way, has nothing to do with globalization. It's a general process that affects the entire planet, but it's not globalization. So globalization is a purely human phenomenon that is not necessarily recent in all its forms, but has increased. And so I wanted to hear a little bit your thoughts about the connection between globalization and the Anthropocene in the framework of your discussion. And something that prompts me to ask this question is a phenomenon that you described, which is that Frankenstein becomes part of the cultural heritage of Indonesia, which is a country that is destroying its cultural heritage, its biocultural diversity at an absolutely huge rate. So this is for me a little sign of some of the potential perversions of globalization. That it is in the end more important for Indonesia to connect to whatever, something that's a remote phenomenon, but at the same time it parallels, and I think it goes hand in hand with the destruction of the local. This is so okay. So this is one question, and the other one is just an observation about the dynamics of change, which are also not necessarily present in your discussion. Which is, what about economics? I mean, what is going to drive the world to consume less palm oil? It's not the fact that the forests are being destroyed, and that someone is going to say, "Oh, let's not destroy the forest." It's economics. Right now, I mean, this very week, there was a huge protest by French peasants. I don't know. I guess it's no longer peasants, the word, but farmers. Yeah, farmers. Sorry, that's the word I was looking for. French farmers who want the French government to limit the import of palm oil, which in France and in Europe is extensively used to produce biodiesel, because they say, we are producing other things here in Europe, in France, and we want the Europeans to use that and not imported palm oil. When that happens at a huge enough scale, maybe there will be less of a demand for palm oil, and that is going to bring it down. Otherwise, there's absolutely, I'm skeptical about almost any other mechanism for that.
Thank you very much for raising this question, and I certainly have a lot of thoughts about globalization and the Anthropocene. There's a lot there, so I've hesitated about it a little bit, but now we have the chance to talk about it. So I think one of the globalization, of course, is a blanket term for so many different processes: economic, cultural, communications, kind of geopolitical interconnectedness and sensitivity and dependencies. And of course, this was happening during the Tambora moment, and it has developed intensively since then. But the kind of globalization driven by colonialism, and specifically by the Dutch and English colonial relationship to Indonesia in the Tambora moment, which is still where very many of our narratives of Tambora's eruption came from, because the local population was absolutely wiped out. There are very, very few indigenous stories as far as my research there has turned up. But there are accounts collected by Sir Raffles of one of sorry, what is he called? The boss, the leader of the the British colony there at the time made an effort to collect accounts of the eruption. Of course, they thought it was gunfire. They thought it was part of a colonial war happening at the time. Also, local lore sometimes construes volcanic eruptions through the kind of anti-colonial narrative. I've read more about this in a Hawaiian context than an Indonesian context, but I think it's suggestive nonetheless, as volcanic eruptions sometimes narrated as a kind of revolt of the earth or of the gods that live in them against harmful activities going on. So I think there must have been a richer history of Tambora in the context of globalization at the moment, in the Tambora in the moment of its eruption. It was part of the way that information did circulate, of course at a much slower pace, but I guess I'm particularly concerned about communications infrastructure as part of the, what changes the climatic condition of, the experience of climatic conditions. Globalization mediates that. In terms of the kind of causal relations, the economic relations, I think, what can I say? I mean, I think I'm kind of strict Marxist on this. I think that many of these problems will be far more responsive to economic interests than they will to consciousness raising or anything of the sort. I mean, Marx says, après-moi le déluge, I'm going to celebrate a deluge this weekend. And in fact, the institutions and the power blocks that are responding to climate change in a significant way are mostly doing so because it's affecting the bottom line. And I mean, maybe nowhere more obviously is this the case than in the case of there are many decommissioned oil rigs that were dragged up to the Arctic, and they can no longer drill there because the seas have become so rough. And so now the oil rig is no longer able to drill. So now, okay, we have to have some climate mitigation run by the oil industry, which I have to say, the oil industry is also one of the main investors in carbon sequestration technology. So I could say a lot more about this, but I just have to recount that maybe you have come across this story, but there was a little bit of a scandal that has leaked out since the Paris Accord, which goes a little something like this. Are the Paris Accords agreement to try to keep the world under 2 degrees Celsius temperature rise premised on a fictitious technology? And what that technology is called biodiesel carbon sequestration and capture, BECCS. And it involves growing huge amounts of a crop to be determined. It could be soybeans, it could be some other crop that can be turned into biodiesel, burning it, capturing the carbon at the plant, and then storing it somewhere, outer space, underground, wherever. This is the technology construed as perhaps a fictitious technology. It is not. It's built into every single IPCC scenario that was used to develop the Paris Agreement. It is presupposed that there will be some mystery technology that will produce negative emissions. So it's not enough, even if we turned off all the engines and the lights right now. We would have to find a way to suck carbon out of the atmosphere in order to meet these goals of limiting rising. The one thing that does that naturally is that the oceans and the forests, plants sequester carbon naturally. They bring them into their tissue fiber as they grow. So when forests grow, they sequester carbon. So it's entirely plausible that we could have a world, it would take, even by the most conservative estimates, something like half the world's arable land, like a continent twice the size of the Indian subcontinent, would have to be covered with these biodiesel carbon sequestration plants, completely given over to this carbon sequestration technology, sucking the carbon, growing the plants, burning them, capturing the fuel and sucking out the carbon that's emitted in the process of burning, and then giving the fuel out, and then, of course, sequestering any remaining carbon. Where is all that carbon going to go? Well, there's one place, only one place it goes right now, which is that it goes back down into the oil wells in Saudi Arabia to help fill them up because they're getting low. And it helps the oil rise up to the top so you can get more out. So I learned in the course of my employment at Arizona State University, which is actually a major research center for carbon sequestration technologies. Klaus Lackner is a scientist, and he's been working on these carbon trees for a long time. There are very serious negotiations to get the billions and billions of dollars that would be required in order to hopefully develop these technologies. And oil companies are really the only forthcoming investors. So, yeah, these are the kind of disturbing facts of globalization, of capitalism, of our economic entanglement with the condition of the world, which is to say that palm oil is a pretty big problem, but it's a drop in the bucket of all of the problems. But what I think is really compelling about this project is at once the particularity of dealing with that landscape, but also the kind of, from an aesthetic perspective, the provocation to think about how we live in these really contradictory and kind of, I hope that this exhibition is both deeply seductive and deeply disturbing, because we are actually incredibly comfortable with climate change. Even I would say myself, I think about it, I work on it, but I ask myself, is inaction actually because change is something that we're more and more okay with? There's the rate of change, as so many sociologists say, everything's changing faster and faster and faster. The idea that the climate is changing, it doesn't seem like it's changing as fast. I don't have to get a new climate as often as I have to get a new cell phone, So I think that this possibility of locating ourselves psychically in any one of these kind of globalized landscapes of extraction and destruction is hugely challenging. And I hope that these stories and images maybe will just be one way of rehearsing the kind of thinking and awareness and kind of also like grappling with our own ethical and political commitments, so that we can maybe deploy those ways of thinking elsewhere.
Her question. And first of all, nice speech. It's you involve everything, and it's very difficult and it's amazing. And well, I'm thinking about. Did you study similar cases? And I'm thinking about Krakatoa. And I know that it's 2,000 years ago, but I think that it changed everything. And that's my question. And Minotaur, I'm not sure if it's in the same date, but Minotaur is also a legend and a monster. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, volcanoes are full of monsters, and I often feel like this project has become a monster I've been chasing it around the world, and it's chasing me, I'm not really sure, because of all these reasons, because of the interconnections are actually, they're hard to convey, but they're really hard to keep track of as well. So yeah, thank you. But I think there are legends, local legends in many places of volcanoes being both a source of life and a source of death. I think they're kind of imaginatively compelling as a source of monsters. And I think the desire to link Frankenstein and the vampire and those monsters to this volcano very, very far away is just, it's implausible in a way because they didn't know about the volcano, but the link is so compelling from a narrative perspective and so suggestive about like how to think about a global context, that I want to stick with it and say that these monsters are somehow born of this volcano, even if it's a very it's certainly not a scientific causal argument in any way, but.
Sorry. What about geoengineering? geoengineering, which seems to... what about geoengineering? Yeah, I think you mentioned one sort of promising, but at the same time very dangerous, or is a sort of new Frankenstein, do you think? Or what the example you were mentioning before would be part of a sort of geoengineering strategy? Do you think that it's worth pursuing research and present projects that are running on now on this field? Because I think we used to approach our present mainly in terms of biotechnologies, communication technologies, any other sort of new materials, nanotechnology, for example. What about this geoengineering as a new emerging field? What do you think of it?
You know, I've been kind of studying it a bit for the last few years, and I've collaborated with this group called PlanetWorks in Arizona. I should just to clarify, I was based in Arizona for a few years, and now I'm based in Europe. But I still collaborate with them because I think it's not enough to say it's happening anyway, therefore it's fine. That's a good enough reason to say it shouldn't happen. And there are many people that are absolutely against doing geoengineering research. And for good reason. I would say the best reason is that it offers a kind of false promise of hope. I think that's a very real concern. I also think geoengineering researchers, I find them reassuring in one way only, which is that in all of the places I've been to do my research, I've only met people in these contexts that take climate change as seriously as I think we need to. And that goes for I've been to only two, but of the COP meetings and a lot of political contexts where people care a lot about climate change, but the sense of urgency is nothing like what I have seen among these geoengineers. They have the kind of the sense of urgency about climate change, the way that a paramedic has the sense of urgency about a patient, whereas other people who might have a much broader understanding, holistic sense of health, or you need a healthy diet, but when there's someone having a heart attack or something right in front of you, you think about addressing the symptoms. And I think that approach that way of thinking is needed in addressing climate change. And also because I think some of the issues that geoengineering governance raise are issues that need to be raised whether or not there's some newfangled doohickey flying around the sky. They force issues of global governance or of collaborative regional governance that the UN doesn't really have resources to deal with, and they're relevant not only for geoengineering but for other kinds of regional cooperation, security, just for thinking about, for example, if one nation or a private company that was located in one nation wanted to do a geoengineering experiment, what responsibilities would they have to neighboring regions, neighboring countries? In a place like in Europe, that's a very different discussion than it is in America, or that it is in Australia, which has a whole continent to itself, right? So these kinds of global policy discussions are they're important and useful and need to be had because they also affect our thinking about migration issues, regional conflicts. So I think geoengineering research, partially because it's so provocative and disturbing, and I actually think it's really important. People who are protesting it and calling it, Frankenplanet, I think that's actually really important because people really should be worried about it. We should be really, really worried about it, and it's a kind of lightning rod for criticism. And I think that it actually plays a really important role in the climate change discussion, even if it's sort of like, oh God, if we don't do something else, we might have to put some stuff up in the sky. Now, that said, I would say at present there's no plausible proposal for anything that would work or be all that useful at any time in the foreseeable future. This is not my perspective. This is like as explained to me as well as I could understand by some of the scientists I've had discussions with. it seems like mimicking the effects of volcanic eruptions. I don't like to call it that, but it only makes sense to me in that way. It's emitting sulfur dioxide, putting sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere. It's probably the most plausible strategy. That's not the same as carbon capture, which everyone agrees that needs to happen. No one knows how to do it, but it could be a relatively harmless thing. I mean, it could be, for example, making it, incentivizing Indonesia not to burn its forest, having a forest more economically viable than making a palm oil snack. And which is to say, also just to say about Indonesia, this is a global problem. I mean, global demand fuels destruction, and there are regional and national decisions about how to respond to various kinds of economic opportunities, but it's the straw between us and those forests is very, very long, but we're sucking on the straw, We're the vampires, like sucking the juice out from very far around the world, and so I think having those conversations about technologies, interventions, where the impact of doing something might be felt very far away, are really important. And look, I hope for the magic machine, but I don't really think it's on the horizon. But I'm not against doing the research because I think there are important outcomes to it.
And I think there was a little bit. This is the end, but it's a little bit depressing as an end. But I guess it's also realistic. Y de todas maneras, te agradecemos una conferencia muy interesante. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was really good, although it depressed us a little bit.
I just have to say thanks so much, and I wouldn't be happy if I sent everyone home smiling and munching a candy bar, but I hope it's provocative enough. So thank you so much.